Before Ross and Rachel, all of America lost sleep over the ultimate enemies to lovers romance, Sam and Diane on the mega hit Cheers. Audiences believed that fiery chemistry was real love. But you were completely fooled. The second the director yelled, "Cut!" these two actors despised each other so deeply they refused to speak a single word. NBC forced two bitter enemies to kiss every night just to rake in $1 billion fortune. Yet that illusion is nothing compared to the hypocrisy of the leading man. The PR machine sanitized Ted Danson into America's husband until he was exposed in the most explosive cheating scandal in Hollywood history, shattering his charming facade and costing him a brutal $30 million divorce. This is the true face of television romance, perfectly scripted on screen, but completely rotting behind the scenes. In 1982, the traditional family sitcom was losing its cultural grip. Networks were bleeding capital, desperately searching for a more sophisticated, adult-oriented anchor for their evening schedules. NBC, trailing significantly in the national ratings and facing severe financial pressure, took a massive corporate gamble on a program set entirely within the claustrophobic, subterranean confines of a Boston bar. The entire commercial viability of this multi-million-dollar investment rested on a single structural pillar: the central tension between the R's owner, a washed-up former athlete, and his new waitress, an overeducated, pretentious academic who had been abandoned by her wealthy fiancé. The network needed a miracle to save their Thursday night lineup, and they found it by engineering a psychological pressure cooker. The casting of these two pivotal roles was a rigorous exercise in finding the perfect, volatile clash of energies. The producers required two actors who could believably occupy entirely different social and intellectual stratospheres. When Shelley Long and Ted Danson were paired together during the final audition process, the network executives and producers immediately observed a distinct spark. However, what they identified radiating from the casting monitors was not the warm glow of romantic chemistry, but the sharp, abrasive friction of two entirely incompatible human beings. They were biologically and professionally mismatched from the moment they shook hands. Shelley Long was not a standard television actress simply looking to hit a taped mark and deliver a network punchline. She was a fiercely intelligent, highly analytical performer, trained in the legendary, rigorous improvisational theaters of Chicago. She viewed comedic acting not as a loose instinct, but as a precise mathematical science. Her professional survival relied on preparation. She demanded a thorough, exhaustive understanding of her character's psychological motivations before a single frame was shot. She frequently requested script revisions from the writers to ensure narrative logic, and she insisted on executing multiple takes to perfect the physical timing of a single minute gesture. She was relentless, uncompromising, and entirely dedicated to the pursuit of the best possible artistic product. For Long, the comedy was a serious architectural build. Ted Danson operated on a completely different professional frequency. He was a working actor who approached his craft with a relaxed, instinctual fluidity. He did not wish to overanalyze the text or dissect the psychological underpinnings of the dialogue. He relied on his natural charisma, his physical presence, and an easygoing rhythm to carry him through a scene. Where Long wanted to halt production to debate the intention of a specific word for an hour, Danson wanted to trust his immediate gut reaction, shoot the scene efficiently, and go home to his family. He viewed the exhaustive rehearsal process as a drain on the natural energy of a performance. This fundamental, irreconcilable difference in methodology created an immediate, palpable tension on the soundstage before the pilot episode had even finished filming. Long viewed Danson's relaxed approach as unprofessional laziness and a blatant lack of respect for the written material. Danson viewed Long's meticulous demands as arrogant, time-wasting neuroticism that unnecessarily prolonged the grueling 14-hour production days. In a standard corporate environment, human resources might intervene to mediate such a profound personality clash to protect the mental well-being of the employees. In the television industry, however, the executives saw a rare opportunity for massive financial exploitation. The producers sat in the darkness of the control room and observed the genuine, unvarnished irritation flashing in Danson's eyes when Long would halt a scene to question a line of dialogue. They watched Long's posture stiffen with real, unfiltered frustration when Danson would miss a physical cue or fail to match her rehearsed intensity. Instead of stepping onto the studio floor to mediate the conflict and foster a healthy working environment, the creators actively retreated to the writer's room and incorporated this very real tension directly into the scripts. They realized a fundamental truth about the camera. Genuine anger and irritation can easily be disguised as suppressed sexual tension. The undeniable chemistry viewers saw radiating from their television screens was actually raw workplace frustration. The biting, vicious insults Sam and Diane hurled at each other felt so shockingly authentic because the actors delivering them were actively channeling their own legitimate grievances and profound annoyance with one another. The writers essentially began taking dictation from the actors' real-life animosity. This corporate strategy established a deeply unhealthy psychological contract on the set, locking both actors into a cycle of severe emotional whiplash. To understand why two professionals would subject themselves to this environment, one must understand the absolute terror of the Hollywood contract system in the early 1980s. Actors are routinely required to sign legally binding 7-year contracts before a pilot episode is even shot. Once the ink is dry, the network effectively owns their professional existence. Long and Danson were not wealthy, untouchable superstars at this juncture. They were working actors seeking basic financial stability in a notoriously volatile industry. The network leveraged this financial vulnerability to trap them. They were professionally and legally bound to execute passionate romantic scenes, to gaze deeply into each other's eyes and simulate profound aching longing under the bright studio lights, while actively refusing to speak a single word to each other the moment the director called cut. The trauma of this dynamic was rooted in the daily requirement to manufacture intimacy with an enemy. Acting is a vulnerable profession requiring trust between scene partners. Long and Danson were stripped of that trust. Every physical touch, every scripted kiss was executed over a foundation of cold resentment. Network executives saw the on-set tension not as a problem, but as a highly profitable asset. The mental toll on the actors became an acceptable operational cost. They effectively locked two incompatible professionals into a televised marriage, letting genuine workplace friction drive their Thursday night ratings. The actors were not permitted to resolve their differences because their genuine friction was the exact product the network was selling to millions of advertisers. If they had somehow managed to become friends, the sharp, aggressive edge of the comedy would have dulled, and the network would have lost its primary narrative engine. Therefore, the production actively sustained the hostility. Every week, Long and Danson were required to tear open their professional wounds for the cameras, transforming their genuine disdain into a masterclass of comedic timing. This was the foundation of the era's greatest television romance, a carefully managed, highly funded hostility that set the stage for a decade of isolation, corporate betrayal, and a workplace environment that would soon turn remarkably cruel. By 1983, the precarious Boston bar comedy transformed from a network liability into an undeniable cultural phenomenon. With this massive, sudden influx of viewership and advertising revenue came a rigid, deeply entrenched power structure on the soundstage. The operational environment of Stage 25 rapidly devolved into a highly exclusive, fraternity-like atmosphere. The supporting male cast members naturally gravitated toward Ted Danson's laid-back, effortlessly charming energy. They formed a cohesive, impenetrable boys' club. Between takes, they played basketball on the studio lot, shared private jokes, and fostered a relaxed camaraderie that completely dominated the physical space of the set. This environment was not necessarily malicious in its inception, but in a high-pressure corporate workplace, a highly exclusive club inevitably requires an outsider. Shelley Long was systematically pushed into that role, and her professional isolation became the defining unspoken reality of the production. Long's isolation was rooted in a fundamental clash of work ethics, which the production crew swiftly weaponized against her. Network television production is a grueling, rapid-fire machine designed to manufacture 22 minutes of content in a matter of days. Time is the ultimate currency, and anyone who slows that machine down is inherently viewed as an enemy of the crew. Long, entirely consumed by the immense pressure of carrying the show's complex, intellectual narrative weight, refused to compromise her theatrical standards. Her meticulous requests for additional takes, born out of a genuine, desperate desire for artistic excellence, were increasingly perceived by the male-dominated cast and crew as the arrogant, time-wasting demands of a diva. She was performing a highly technical, award-winning comedy routine every week while suffocating under the weight of genuine workplace hostility. The psychological trauma of this daily isolation was profound and sustained. Long was delivering a culturally defining performance, effectively establishing the blueprint for the modern sitcom heroine. Yet she was forced to do so in a complete vacuum of professional support. The subtle eye rolls from her co-stars when she asked the director for clarification became significantly less subtle as the seasons progressed. She was frequently excluded from offset gatherings and informal meetings. The trauma of her position lay in the severe cognitive dissonance required to execute her job. She was required to be the intellectual anchor and the primary source of emotional vulnerability on screen, while simultaneously keeping her defensive guard absolutely raised the moment the camera stopped rolling. The corporate system had placed the heaviest creative burden on the very person the cast had collectively decided to ostracize. It was a daily exhausting exercise in psychological endurance, forcing her to manufacture warmth, romance, and comedic brilliance in a room full of people who openly resented her presence. The most chilling aspect of this environment was the absolute calculated blindness of the network executives and the show's creators. NBC and Paramount possessed a perfectly clear view of the toxicity brewing on the lot. The producers sat in the control booths every day. They knew their leading lady was profoundly isolated, stressed, and miserable. However, corporate morality is dictated entirely by Nielsen ratings and profit margins. As long as the program dominated Thursday nights and syndication valuations skyrocketed into the hundreds of millions, the studio treated the toxic workplace dynamics as an entirely acceptable operational cost. Intervention meant risking the formula that kept audiences laughing, so the executives simply looked the other way. By stepping back, the network effectively endorsed the boys' club and validated Long's isolation. They determined that as long as the cash flow remained uninterrupted, the psychological damage inflicted on their female lead was simply the price of doing business in Hollywood. They allowed the set to operate as a pressure cooker, perfectly content to let the tension rise as long as the audience kept laughing. But this unchecked toxicity was fundamentally unsustainable. The network executives knew that eventually the pressure would fracture the production from the inside. To prepare for this inevitable rupture, the Hollywood public relations machinery initiated a massive external campaign. They needed to ensure their leading man was completely protected from any potential fallout, and they found the perfect, impenetrable shield in a genuine, devastating private tragedy. When a massive corporate entity recognizes a severe structural flaw within its most profitable workplace, the immediate institutional instinct is rarely to fix the flaw. The instinct is to aggressively manage the optics. The television network executives knew perfectly well that the situation on their Boston bar soundstage was highly volatile. They were acutely aware of the deep isolation of their leading lady and the unchecked, fraternity-like power structure coalescing around their leading man. They needed an insurance policy. They needed a way to guarantee that if the toxic reality of the production ever leaked to the entertainment press, the public would simply refuse to believe it. To achieve this, the network public relations machinery required a narrative powerful enough to blind the audience. They found the raw material for this narrative in a profoundly genuine and devastating private medical emergency. In 1979, 3 years before the casting process for the comedy even began, Ted Danson experienced a catastrophic personal crisis. His wife, Casey Coates, suffered a massive, debilitating stroke during the birth of their first child. The medical reality of the situation was incredibly bleak. She was left paralyzed on her left side, facing a terrifying and uncertain future. The trauma of this event was absolute, undeniable, and deeply human. Danson stepped away from his struggling, early-stage acting career without hesitation. He slept on cold hospital floors for weeks. He actively participated in her grueling daily physical rehabilitation, supporting her through the most agonizing period of their lives. This was a moment of profound human suffering that demanded genuine empathy. It was a private ordeal that tested the absolute limits of their physical and emotional endurance. However, in the ruthless and highly transactional ecosystem of the Hollywood public relations industry, a private tragedy is rarely permitted to remain private if it possesses a marketable emotional narrative. As the sitcom exploded into a global cultural juggernaut between 1984 and 1986. The network publicists and the actor's management team recognized the immense tactical value of his personal history. The corporate machinery did not merely view his wife's stroke as a past hardship to be respected. They actively co-opted and weaponized it as a massive public relations asset. They deployed this narrative with clinical forensic precision to construct a saintly, untouchable persona for their leading man. The public relations strategy was brilliantly calculated. The network needed a thick firewall between the deeply flawed, womanizing character on the screen and the actor who portrayed him. Danson was aggressively marketed across national magazines, daytime talk shows, and evening entertainment broadcasts. He was not just promoted as a talented comedic actor with great timing. He was carefully packaged and sold to the American public as the ultimate devoted husband. Glossy feature articles meticulously detailed his past sacrifices, his unwavering loyalty in the face of tragedy, and his ongoing role as a dedicated family caretaker. He was photographed pushing his wife's wheelchair, looking thoughtfully into the camera, projecting an aura of grounded working-class nobility that perfectly resonated with middle America. The contrast was deliberately engineered by the corporate press teams. On Thursday nights, the public laughed at the shallow, promiscuous bartender who avoided commitment and moral responsibility at all costs. But on Friday mornings, sitting in waiting rooms or reading at breakfast tables, they read heartwarming profiles about the deeply moral, self-sacrificing family man. The viewing public, particularly the mature audience who valued traditional loyalty, eagerly consumed this narrative. It offered a deeply comforting reassurance that solid family values still existed within the notoriously decadent landscape of the entertainment industry. The audience projected their own desires for moral certainty directly onto the actor, elevating him far beyond the status of a mere television celebrity. This manufactured saintly image rendered the leading man practically untouchable within the industry and the press. The public was successfully and thoroughly conditioned to view him as a figure of absolute moral authority. This conditioning created a massive, highly effective blind spot in the cultural consciousness. By elevating the actor to the status of a living martyr, the network effectively neutralized any potential scrutiny regarding his off-screen behavior, his work ethic, or his central role in the hostile workplace dynamics occurring daily on the set. The press simply stopped digging for flaws because the established narrative of the suffering, loyal husband was far too profitable and popular to disrupt. The psychological impact of this specific PR strategy on the daily operations of the production was devastating, most notably for Shelley Long. The public canonization of her co-star compounded her isolation and trapped her in an impossible, suffocating professional bind. She was already battling the daily hostility of the male-dominated crew and the resentment of her colleagues. Now she was facing an impenetrable brick wall of public perception. The corporate machine had successfully framed the man making her workplace miserable as a national hero. If Long had ever attempted to voice genuine grievances to the press or the network executives about her co-star's lack of preparation, his dismissive attitude, or the exclusive boys' club he cultivated, she would have been immediately positioned on the wrong side of an unassailable narrative. She could not publicly or privately complain about him because the industry and the public had already unilaterally decided that he was a saint. Complaining about the man who sacrificed his career to nurse his paralyzed wife would be absolute professional suicide. The public relations shield designed to protect the network's multi-million-dollar asset functioned as a strict, invisible gag order on his leading lady. The corporate system effectively weaponized his private grief to enforce her professional silence. This dynamic perfectly illustrates the fundamental cruelty of the entertainment corporate structure. The network executives did not promote this heartwarming narrative out of genuine respect for the actors' family struggles or out of a desire to raise awareness for stroke victims. They promoted it exclusively to protect their advertising revenue. They recognized that a scandal involving their leading man would immediately sink their most profitable property. By making him a moral icon, they insulated their investment from the chaotic reality of human behavior. They monetized his trauma to protect their syndication value. As the calendar turned to 1986, the sitcom reached the absolute zenith of its critical and commercial success. It was the undisputed king of network broadcasting, generating unprecedented wealth and dominating the cultural conversation across the globe. Yet behind the flawless corporate facade, the internal structure of the production was nearing a catastrophic failure. The pressure inside the soundstage had nowhere to vent. The hostility was entirely bottled up by millions of dollars in contracts and aggressive public relations management. Shelley Long was physically and psychologically exhausted. She had spent 5 years carrying the intense, demanding narrative weight of the central romance while existing in a state of constant, grinding defensive isolation. She had watched her co-star be elevated to a deity by the press, while she was systematically ostracized by the crew and entirely ignored by the executives who profited from her talent. The daily requirement to manufacture brilliant comedy in a room full of people who resented her had drained her reserves. The breaking point was no longer a theoretical possibility discussed in hushed tones by the producers. It was an imminent, unavoidable reality that would soon force the network into a state of absolute panic. The breaking point of a heavily funded corporate operation rarely manifests as a sudden dramatic explosion. Instead, it arrives through a quiet, calculated exercise of contractual autonomy. By late 1986, the psychological pressure within the Boston bar set had reached an unsustainable threshold. Shelley Long reached the absolute limit of her endurance. She was not fired. She was not forced out by declining ratings or shifting network priorities. She made a unilateral, deliberate choice to terminate her involvement with the most successful comedy on American television. When she officially notified the network executives that she would not renew her contract following the 5th season, she triggered an immediate, high-stakes corporate panic. A forensic look at the 1980s television industry reveals the sheer magnitude of this decision. Network television was a closed, highly lucrative ecosystem. Leaving a #1 hit meant walking away from guaranteed millions of dollars, unprecedented global visibility, and the absolute security of a primetime staple. Actors simply did not leave dominant shows by choice. It defied all standard industry logic. Long's decision was an emergency exit. The sheer desperation required to voluntarily abandon the most lucrative position in Hollywood provides the clearest evidence of exactly how toxic the studio environment had become. She calculated that her psychological survival and artistic integrity were worth significantly more than the massive syndication checks. The executives in the NBC boardrooms faced a terrifying fiscal reality. The entire valuation of their property was predicated on the unresolved romantic tension between the two leads. By removing the intellectual female anchor, Long was threatening to collapse a billion-dollar structure. The network initially deployed aggressive financial incentives, offering massive salary increases to buy her compliance. They assumed, as corporate entities often do, that enough capital could anesthetize any level of workplace misery. When money failed to secure her signature, the corporate strategy violently pivoted from retention to containment. To protect the remaining asset, the industry required a highly visible scapegoat. The corporate public relations machine initiated a brutal, coordinated campaign of character assassination against the departing actress. The media, heavily reliant on network access for their own survival, eagerly participated in the execution. Long was systematically branded across the entertainment press as difficult, delusional, and grossly ungrateful. The narrative pushed to the public was that she possessed a massive, unmanageable ego. The press claimed she foolishly believed she was bigger than the ensemble, and that she was selfishly abandoning her loyal castmates to pursue a doomed film career. This specific media spin was incredibly effective because it fed into deeply entrenched industry biases. When a male actor demands script revisions and multiple takes, he is often praised as a dedicated perfectionist. When a female actress executes the exact same demands, she is routinely labeled as a disruptive diva. The network weaponized her meticulous work ethic against her. They leaked carefully curated stories to gossip columnists, highlighting her requests for rehearsal time as evidence of her unreasonableness. They deliberately painted her as the villain to ensure the audience remained loyal to the bar, protecting the brand from the fallout of her departure. This media barrage served a vital secondary purpose. It punished Long for breaking the corporate contract, and it simultaneously reinforced the impenetrable shield around Ted Danson. He was actively framed by the press as the dedicated, hard-working professional left behind by a selfish co-star. The narrative suggested he had valiantly tolerated her neuroses for 5 years, further cementing his reputation as a patient, saintly figure. The network successfully ushered Long out the door under a dark cloud of coordinated negative press, leaving the hostile fraternity she had helped enrich completely intact and entirely unaccountable for their behavior. Her departure successfully preserved her sanity. She escaped the daily psychological grind of the toxic soundstage, freeing herself from the exhausting requirement to manufacture romance with a man who resented her. She refused to be a casualty of the corporate machine. However, her exit fundamentally and permanently altered the power dynamic of the entire enterprise. With the meticulous, demanding actress permanently removed from the lot, the primary check on Danson's power vanished. For half a decade, Long had inadvertently served as a vital structural counterweight. Her presence had prevented the leading man from assuming total dictatorial control over the production. When she walked away, she left behind a massive vacuum of power. The network executives, desperate to maintain their dominant Thursday night ratings, quickly cast a new female lead who possessed a highly accommodating, eager-to-please energy that perfectly aligned with the established boys' club. The friction was gone, the set was pacified, and the leading man stepped seamlessly into the void, consolidating absolute, unchallenged authority over the most profitable television program in the world. The network had successfully protected their leading man and survived the transition. They secured their advertising rates and kept the syndication machine running. But by granting him absolute unchecked leverage within the production, they inadvertently set the stage for a spectacular public detonation down the line. They removed the only professional boundary holding him accountable, placing him in an insulated bubble of extreme wealth and zero consequence. The corporate executives believed they had solved their immediate personnel problem, entirely unaware that their solution was quietly building a far more destructive crisis. With the primary source of professional friction permanently removed from the soundstage, the operational ecosystem of the Boston bar comedy underwent a rapid, radical mutation. The new female lead was brought in specifically because her energy was highly accommodating and eager to please. She assimilated perfectly into the established boys' club, offering no resistance to the prevailing culture. The resulting environment was entirely pacified. For the network executives, this lack of friction meant smoother, faster production days and fewer headaches. For the leading man, it meant the sudden, effortless acquisition of total, unchecked dictatorial control over the television industry's most valuable real estate. He was no longer just the star of an ensemble cast. He was the undisputed, unchallenged monarch of the Paramount lot. Between 1987 and 1992, the financial leverage accumulated by the leading actor defied standard entertainment industry metrics. As the program transitioned from a weekly primetime hit into a historic global syndication juggernaut, his salary escalated to previously unimaginable heights. By the final seasons, he was commanding a staggering $500,000 per episode. Examining the psychological reality of this era requires looking directly at what that specific level of wealth represents within the confined hierarchical environment of a television studio. $500,000 for 22 minutes of broadcast television does not merely purchase luxury, it purchases absolute unblinking silence. It buys the instant compliance of every producer, writer, camera operator, and publicist on the corporate payroll. He effectively became the chief executive officer of his own immensely lucrative sovereign state. When an individual is surrounded exclusively by people whose mortgages, health insurance, and career trajectories depend entirely on his continued happiness, the fundamental boundaries of acceptable social and professional behavior dissolve. No one on the lot possessed the authority or the financial security to challenge his decisions, question his work ethic, or hold him accountable to standard ethical norms. The industry effectively anesthetized him to consequence. He was granted a level of operational freedom that almost inevitably leads to poor, destructive decision-making. The corporate apparatus surrounding him was specifically designed to instantly sweep any resulting collateral damage entirely under the rug. This extreme isolation from reality fostered a profound, staggering arrogance. This unchecked leverage facilitated the creation of a deeply divided, highly dangerous dual life. The corporate public relations machine continued to aggressively market the established, lucrative narrative of the saintly, devoted family man. The public, heavily conditioned by years of carefully curated magazine profiles, detailing his heroic sacrifices during his wife's medical crisis, continued to view him with unwavering moral reverence. This PR shield remained firmly intact, providing him with impenetrable social armor. However, beneath the polished surface of this manufactured morality, his private reality was diverging significantly. The absolute power he wielded on the studio lot convinced him that the rules applying to ordinary citizens simply did not apply to him. The inevitable collision between this heavily protected manufactured saintliness and his private actions finally occurred in the spring of 1992. During the filming hiatus for the sitcom, he was cast opposite the globally famous Academy Award-winning actress Whoopi Goldberg in the feature film Made in America. The filming took place on location, far removed from the highly controlled, isolated, and protective environment of the Paramount television lot. Away from the daily surveillance of the sitcom executives and the carefully managed routine of his domestic life, the leading man and his co-star began a highly visible, intensely passionate, extramarital affair. In ordinary circumstances, a married A-list television star engaging in an affair with an Oscar-winning actress would trigger an immediate, catastrophic media feeding frenzy. The tabloids of the early 1990s were notoriously aggressive, building massive circulation numbers on the lucrative business of exposing celebrity hypocrisy. Yet, the initial response from the mainstream entertainment press was characterized by a strange, highly uncharacteristic hesitation. The affair was an open secret within the upper echelons of the industry. Paparazzi captured photographs of them together off-set, and the whispers echoed through every major talent agency and casting office in Los Angeles. But the major broadcasting networks, the glossy entertainment magazines, and the powerful television critics deliberately chose not to detonate the story with the ferocity it warranted. Tracing the root cause of this industry-wide blackout leads directly to the corporate ledger. In 1992, the Boston bar comedy was entering its 11th and final season. The program was no longer just a television show. It was a multi-billion-dollar corporate asset. The syndication rights were actively being negotiated globally for astronomical sums, securing the financial futures of the executives and the parent company. The entire financial valuation of this massive asset relied entirely on the public's enduring affection for the character of the lovable, charming bartender. The network executives recognized a terrifying reality. If the entertainment press exposed their leading man, the very individual the industry had spent a decade marketing as America's most devoted, morally upright husband, as a brazen adulterer abandoning his disabled wife, the public backlash would be severe and instantaneous. The wholesome, comforting illusion of the Thursday night comedy would be permanently tainted by the sordid reality of its star. Therefore, a silent, implicit mandate was executed across the elite tiers of the entertainment media. The industry collectively decided to protect the investment. Studio publicists called in massive, career-defining favors. Network executives leveraged exclusive access to their other high-profile stars to kill damaging stories about the affair before they went to print. The media deliberately looked the other way, choosing to protect a highly profitable syndication stream rather than report the truth. They allowed the actor to continue his highly public indiscretion while simultaneously allowing him to maintain the facade of the respectable family man in the eyes of the mature viewing audience. The corporate machine successfully held the line, protecting the financial culmination of their decade-long investment. They believed they could manage the optics of the affair indefinitely, assuming that the immense public relations architecture they had built was strong enough to weather any private storm. But corporate executives frequently underestimate the sheer destructive hubris that absolute power breeds within their top earners. They had protected him so thoroughly and insulated him from consequence so completely that they had inadvertently convinced him he was entirely bulletproof. He believed his own manufactured myth. He looked at the media's silence and interpreted it not as a fragile corporate conspiracy, but as absolute proof of his own cultural immunity. This profound, staggering arrogance, born of a decade of unchecked corporate enabling, set the stage for a catastrophic miscalculation that would bypass all network protection. The architecture of extreme corporate shielding inevitably creates a psychological vacuum for the protected asset. By the autumn of 1993, the leading man had spent over a decade completely insulated from the basic consequences of human behavior. This prolonged insulation forged a staggering blindness to cultural and ethical boundaries. The network executives and highly paid publicists had successfully convinced him that his massive television popularity granted him total cultural immunity. This unchecked hubris propelled him onto a stage in New York City, initiating an event that bypassed all corporate protection and permanently detonated his manufactured legacy in a matter of minutes. The venue for this catastrophic miscalculation was the Friars Club, a historic entertainment institution renowned for hosting exclusive comedy roasts. These events were traditionally environments of aggressive, boundary-pushing humor, historically insulated from the general public and press scrutiny. However, the performance he chose to deliver was not a miscalculated joke or a slight lapse in professional judgment. It was an astonishing display of racial and sexual insensitivity that completely shattered the parameters of acceptable entertainment, even within a notoriously lenient industry format. He walked up to the podium to honor his co-star and romantic partner, wearing full, highly offensive theatrical makeup. He proceeded to deliver a routine heavily saturated with crude racial caricatures and explicit, vulgar descriptions of their private relationship. The performance was a catastrophic misjudgment of his own cultural standing. He genuinely believed that the public affection for his television character, combined with his elite Hollywood status, provided him the absolute license to execute a highly offensive act in front of a live audience without facing any backlash. He assumed the corporate shield would hold firm. He was entirely wrong. The media reaction was instantaneous, violent, and utterly corrective. The protective shell that the publicists had meticulously maintained since the early 1980s disintegrated in a single evening. The entertainment press, which had previously turned a blind eye to his extramarital affair, specifically to protect the sitcom's syndication value, could no longer contain the massive fallout. The sheer visual shock of America's favorite, wholesome television bartender Standing on a podium engaging in such a display was too massive for any corporate fixer to suppress or spin. The scandal dominated national headlines, forcing the mature viewing public to brutally reconcile the comforting, charming fiction they watched on Thursday nights with the offensive reality captured in the press photographs. The destruction of the public facade immediately triggered the total collapse of his private reality. The carefully constructed narrative of the devoted, self-sacrificing husband had been his primary defense mechanism against all public scrutiny. With that narrative completely incinerated by the affair and the subsequent club scandal, the actual legal and financial consequences of his actions materialized with terrifying speed. The corporate lawyers who had protected his television career from on-set complaints and media leaks were entirely powerless to shield his bank account from the cold mathematical realities of marital law. Within weeks of the public detonation and the undeniable exposure of his double life, his wife filed for divorce, officially ending a marriage that the network had cynically utilized as a public relations prop for years. The justice system executed a massive, historic financial reckoning. He was forced to pay a $30 million settlement, registering at the time as one of the most expensive and highly publicized divorce settlements in legal history. The financial devastation was absolute and immediate. The profound irony of this settlement provides a stark, unforgiving commentary on the mechanics of the Hollywood machine. The millions of dollars he had accumulated, wealth generated by a network that systematically isolated his female co-star and sold a fabricated version of his morality to corporate advertisers, were instantly surrendered as a direct consequence of his own unchecked arrogance. The corporate system had made him extraordinarily rich by hiding his flaws, and the legal system systematically stripped him of that wealth the exact moment his flaws became undeniable to the public. The isolation that followed this financial ruin was swift, total, and remarkably cold. Shortly after the devastation of the divorce became public record, the highly publicized relationship that had catalyzed the entire scandal abruptly ended. The leading man found himself completely marooned. The protective fraternity of the studio lot had long since disbanded following the sitcom's series finale. The public goodwill, cultivated over a decade of false magazine profiles and orchestrated interviews, had evaporated into anger and profound disappointment. The industry executives, having already secured their billions in syndication deals, quietly and efficiently distanced themselves from his radioactive public image. They had extracted the maximum possible value from his performance and now viewed him strictly as a liability. He was left standing in the wreckage of a completely fractured reputation, facing a massive financial deficit, entirely stripped of the corporate armor that had dictated his reality for 11 years. The system that created him discarded him the exact moment he threatened their bottom line. The enduring multi-billion-dollar success of this specific Boston bar comedy relies entirely on the audience's willingness to consume a comfortable illusion. The television network achieved a historic financial victory by executing a ruthless psychological operation on both their employees and their viewers. They recognized the genuine bitter hostility between their two leading actors and successfully monetized it. They trapped a meticulous, brilliant actress in a hostile work environment, using her isolation to generate the narrative tension required to keep viewers engaged. They built an impenetrable public relations fortress around a flawed leading man, selling a fabricated story of moral perfection to a trusting American public. This partnership remains the definitive textbook case of industry manipulation. It serves as a permanent forensic reminder that the entertainment business operates entirely devoid of empathy, proving the most compelling television romances are often meticulously constructed corporate diversions designed specifically to hide the most dysfunctional realities occurring just out of frame.